So in today's lecture, we're going to speed run the anatomy of the leaf. We're going to start large scale and look first at a full leaf, and then we will sort of zoom in incrementally, step by step, and talk through all the way up into the chloroplast and the structure of the chloroplast. So let's get into it. And we're looking into this in order to better understand the mechanics of how photosynthesis actually occurs within a leaf.
At the structural level. So when we're looking at a leaf holistically as an organism, we have to kind of identify the structural differences between the top layer of a leaf and the bottom layer of a leaf. Both sides of the leaf are incredibly different. The top side of the leaf is waxy so that it can repel water, but also it can protect itself from the harsh UV exposure because plants are not able to apply sunscreen.
Right, we don't want to get any sunburns. On the bottom side of the leaf, if you look at that right picture, you'll notice that waxy cuticle is not present. And if you've ever grabbed a leaf and felt it, you can feel a pretty distinct difference in the top and the bottom of the leaf. On the bottom side of the leaf, this is where gas exchange occurs. So we know that leaves and plants are involved with carbon dioxide and oxygen. That gas exchange, as well as water vapor, occurs in the bottom side of the leaf in something called the stomata.
And I think it's also important to note that the top side of the leaf is always a lot greener than the bottom side. That has to do with the concentration of chlorophyll, which is a pigment within the leaf cells that are going to make the leaf cells conducive to photosynthesis.
I think that's a great lead into our cross-section of our leaf tissue. So if we take a look at this first picture, the one on the left here, we've got what we call a cross-section of a leaf. As you can see on the top side, you've got that cuticle labeled. This is that waxy protective layer that Mr. Pfeiffer was just talking about.
And it is very thin. Okay, this is not a layer of cells. The cuticle is just a waxy layer on top of this first layer of cells, which is the upper epidermis. This upper epidermis is very similar to your skin. It's a single layer of cells that isn't photosynthetic, so notice it is not green, but this is just the first layer of cells that kind of gives structural integrity to the leaf. If you move inside from that upper epidermis, you'll see the green layer. We call this the palisade layer. It is the first of the mesophyll layer. The palisade layer contains all of the chloroplasts, which we'll get to in the next slide, but the chloroplast contains the photosynthetic pigment, which is chlorophyll, which is where all photosynthetic activity takes place.
So while you are looking at the palisade mesophyll, you might notice how densely packed those cells are together, and that is for the reason that Mr. Pfeiffer just mentioned, is that this is the layer where photosynthesis is occurring, at least for the most part. Almost all photosynthesis in the leaf occurs in this layer, and it is densely packed as a response, and so each of those cells is going to possess many chloroplasts in order to do as much photosynthesis as possible. So moving down from there, you see the next layer, which is called the spongy mesophyll. The spongy mesophyll gets its name because, as you can see, there are large spaces and gaps in between the cells, and this creates the ability for that gas exchange that we mentioned previously to occur.
And so the gases coming in would be CO2, which is carbon dioxide, and the gases leaving for that gas exchange would be O2. Oxygen obviously leaving because oxygen is a byproduct of photosynthesis, and CO2 coming in is a reactant of photosynthesis, which we'll get to in a later video. But carbon dioxide and oxygen are going to be exchanged through these little holes called stroma or stomata, and if you look at those, they are actually regulated so that they can open and close to regulate the gas exchange. When photosynthetic activity is at its peak, they're going to be open so that there is a lot of gas exchange, a lot of CO2 entering, a lot of O2 exiting. But in times when photosynthetic activity isn't needed or isn't happening, they actually close, and that helps to conserve water because not only is CO2 and O2 exchanging, water vapor is also coming out as a result of transpiration.
Very good. Moving on, we're going to zoom into the chloroplast. Again, the chloroplast is the organelle in plant cells responsible for photosynthesis. And there are several key structures that you need to know. First, and we sort of mentioned this during the cells unit, we talked a little bit about the chloroplast, but there are two membranes. There's an inner and outer membrane. So this is a double membraned organelle. And then within this inner membrane, you'll notice that there are stacks of something called a thylakoid, which when stacked together we refer to as a grana or granum. And then around that would be the stroma.
And we talked a lot in our cell unit about structure and function and how structure dictates function. And we also talked about surface area to volume ratio. So it is very important for these discs to be flat because that is a structural adaptation to increase surface area to volume ratio. So the surface of this particular disc is flat to allow a lot of light absorption to take place. This would be where all of the sunlight is absorbed. Inside of all of these thylakoid membranes, which we'll get to in a later, more in-depth photosynthetic video, is all of the pigment. Those pigment proteins are going to be embedded in the thylakoid membrane. They're going to be absorbing all of the sunlight in order to produce glucose, essentially, which is the purpose of photosynthesis. But for now, we're talking just structural adaptations of the plant, and at the very base level, structurally speaking, the chloroplast is the site of all photosynthetic activity.
So over the next couple of videos, we will get more in-depth into the process, step by step of photosynthesis. But for now, your takeaways are some of the leaf structures and chloroplast structure as well.
Yeah, this is very overview-esque, but we'll dive in and get a lot more detailed. Thanks for watching. See ya.
Have a good one.